Welcome to Make Things That Matter, the podcast where we explore impactful products and the cultures that create them. I'm your host, Andrew Scottsko, and if I'm doing my job well, each episode of this show will help you to do meaningful work, make things that make things better, and have a great experience doing it. I'm your host, Andrew Scottsko, and my guest in this episode is none other than the OG himself, Ash Maurya. Now, I say OG because Ash is one of those people whose work in one way or another has been shaping the conversation of all things product development and lean startup for well over a decade now. Ash is the best-selling author of Running Lean and Scaling Lean. He's also the creator of the Lean Canvas, which is one of the most widely used tools out there to visualize how the pieces of a new business all fit together. It's actually one of my favorite tools for thinking through new ideas. Now, Ash has just released his latest thinking on this idea of the innovator's gift in the third edition of his book, Running Lean, which just came out. In this conversation, we go deep on where and how you can find problems worth solving. That is, challenges that are actually worth your time. We explore the sequence of hidden milestones that are on the way to product market fit, which I was not aware of before this conversation, and how to identify your true early adopters, how to know what action to take. We also cover foundational territory on jobs to be done, which is one of my favorite frameworks to better understand what people actually need, want, and buy. Without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this terrific deep dive with one of the best innovation thinkers out there, Ash Maurya. Ash, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just great. Pleasure to be on.
Absolutely. I'm such a fan of your work. You and I have traded the occasional email for at least 5 years now. So it's such a pleasure to, actually get to spend some quality time together and really dive into your material. I think I've said this before, but your work is up there with anybody who's influenced my thinking. Among the most influential pieces of bodies of work on my thinking as like a product person and a person who thinks about putting new stuff in the world. So I'm just stoked you're here.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, it's going to be a blast.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the places I always like to start is just getting to know you a little bit better, right? So you've been an author in this space for like a decade now, but even before that, I know you were building things of your own. And I'm just so curious, what was the moment where you realized I need to get this out of my head and share this with the world? Was there a moment like that where it just became very clear to you?
I would say that I started with blog posting. That's how I got into writing. And I found that every time I wrote a blog post, it clarified my own thinking. But I wrote for myself. I mean, there happened to be an audience, but it was really more for me writing to get things out there. And if it helps someone, that's great. But it was really more of a very personal thing in the beginning. But the moment when it became about others, I can't really put a date to it. But I think just as with anyone who puts any work out there, including this podcast, once you build an audience, you can't help but be influenced by them. And so seeing the reaction there got me. There was a trigger in my head that said, I'm not the only one going through this journey. There are lots of people that are hitting the same questions, roadblocks, fears, concerns, wanting to know how to put this to practice. And that just became very exciting. The timing was also great. That was also when there were meetups being formed around the lean startup. And so there were easy places that one could go to and find like-minded people and just go and have a conversation and geek out about the stuff. So all of that taken together is just got me started.
Yeah, no, I remember. I think I first was it like 2009 or 10 when you started on that process? Does that sound right to you?
Late 2009, yeah. So I mean, that's very vivid because that was when I started this particular blog post, and that's the first post there. So it was like, I think October 2009.
Yeah, no, because I was sitting here thinking about like, when did I first come across your stuff? And I think because that was right when I was getting into all of this, and you were, I think, one of the first people whose material I came across. I think I remember buying like your early PDF or something and emailing you like a billion questions, and you were very gracious and actually wrote me back. But
oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, I was looking for this the other day. I was like, wait a minute, I remember this because you're right. That was that really fun period, like before like the quote lean startup was a thing, and there was just basically a bunch of us going to meetup groups and like hanging out over a beer or a coffee and just talking about this stuff. So man, what a crazy journey it's been. How's it evolved in that time?
So I would say that the practice has certainly evolved. I mean, a lot of the principles are out there. At the same time, as with anything, it starts out rather pure. And then just with the practice, it evolves sometimes in good directions, sometimes in maybe not so good directions. And so I think all par for the course. You can take any framework or methodology, whether it's agile or anything like that, and you kind of have that similar journey. There's the initial momentum and hype curve, and that's those early days where everyone was talking about this. Still, lots of core principles, a lot of emphasis or exploration on how-tos. And then, there's a group of people doing this. Everyone else kind of ignores you and says, this is just nothing. And then everyone kind of joins the party. And then that's when it just becomes another challenge where everyone now thinks they know, they understand the principles, they know how to do it. And like I said, then the evolution really happens. So that's just kind of par for course with any framework. And this one is no different. So certainly lots of things have changed, like basic definitions, things like MVP, for example, is one of those things where you can go on your favorite platform, LinkedIn, even Twitter, and you will find, I still see this every other day. There's a new MV something, minimum viable, desirable or feasible or, sustainable product, and people coming up with their takes of it, which is all good. So we want to have that conversation, but it just seems like it's deja vu. We have these cycles every so often.
Yeah, it's like we forget we did this 5 years ago, and then we're like, oh, it's new. And we're like, actually, that was
right.
5 years, Anyways, you're one of the few people I've seen really holistically integrate this, is the jobs to be done framework. And I've seen a lot of different takes on that framework over the years, whether it's Bob Mesta's work, or Alan Clements or any of these things. But I think you're the only person I've seen actually like fully integrate that into a playbook for early stage work, which I certainly appreciated. So talk to me about the innovator's gift. Like, if I don't know what that is, what is the innovator's gift? Could you just define that for the listener?
Yeah. So when we are charged with building a better product, the big $1 million or $1 billion question is, what does better really mean? And a lot of us entrepreneurs, innovators, product people define it with respect to our solution. So we almost say, I'm going to build X. What's better about X? And then we start imagining the customer who will use it. The problem with that is that many times that's not how the customer views the world. So the idea of the innovator's gift is this realization that in order to build something better, it has to be better with respect to something. And that's where the existing solution lives. And so the other way of saying this is that when we are trying to build a new innovative product, we want an innovative solution, a new way to build the thing or solve, get the job done. We don't want an innovative problem. If the problem is new and something your customer doesn't know or understand, that's going to get you into trouble because they're just not going to want your product. So the idea of the innovator's gift is let's not start with chasing new problems. We need to actually find old existing problems that people are currently struggling with. And the way you do that is by studying their old existing solutions to get the job done. And that's where we find true problems worth solving. That's where we find these switching moments where Uber comes along and all of a sudden they break taxis, or Tesla comes along and all of a sudden they break sports cars for people because Teslas can go fast and they're green, right? So that kind of thinking is what the innovator's gift is about.
Yeah, it seems like it's almost sort of an innovation or product application of that. What's that old writing saw about, like, there's no new things, there's just old things said in new ways?
Sure.
So one of the things that I love that I heard you talk about in a webinar of yours that I was on like a year ago, right? Depth of the pandemic, everyone's freaking out. This is like early 2021. And you were talking a lot at that time about switching triggers. So I'd love you to just lay just a little bit of a conceptual foundation here, so the listeners with us, of like, just really quick, what is a switching trigger, and like, are there different kinds that we need to be aware of?
Yeah. So if we again take that idea of the innovator's gift, the basic premise is that we don't actually buy a new product. We switch from something old to something new. And a switching trigger is what prompts that action. And there can be many different kinds of switching triggers. So pandemic, the one you just mentioned here, is probably the biggest switching trigger we've all lived through in our lifetimes. And probably some of us, we're still going through it. But it changed the world. So when there's something like a pandemic comes along, it changes the world. It breaks a lot of old ways of doing things, from how we work, how we go to school, how we eat, how we go to restaurants. All of these things break. And all of a sudden, people are now more open to behavior change. They still want the desired outcome, which is, I need to do all those things. How we do it is where the opportunity, and that crisis is where we find these opportunities. So that's kind of the basic definition of switching triggers. And then there are various kind of types of them as you described, as you mentioned.
So you're talking about these different kinds of switching triggers. our job isn't to make a new thing. Our job is to cause a switch. And so it seems like this is really a central idea that we've got to understand. So I guess the question that leaves me with is, how do we find, like, some of the switching triggers, super obvious, right? You have a pandemic. It broke the status quo. Okay, that happens. But that is not always, thank God, that's not always the case. So in the case of a like less in our face switching trigger, how do you, or where you don't know it, like let's say somebody has a product idea, how do they go about actually finding the trigger? Like how do they figure out what it is that they need to work with there if they don't already know?
Sure. So we are looking for something changing in the world that can be at a macro level. So pandemic is one of those. And even along those lines, there can be kind of smaller events, of course. There can be things like new inventions. It could be some new technology. You know, we're all into this NFT world right now, and that's kind of a thing that's happening, and it's changing at least some people's behaviors or how they might kind of interact with that. And so exploring that further. But those are the examples of things, whether they are inventions. You know, the internet, when it hit the scene, was another one of those. It, of course, was a massive change, but it started small. It didn't start, changing everything all at once. But kind of those kinds of things are places we can look. But really the best way I find is to go and do some discovery work. So this is where, when we bring this idea of the job to be done, whenever I work with a team that has an idea, I try to have them list out some existing ways that their customers could currently try to do this thing. And on the Lean Canvas box, that would be the existing alternative box. So let's figure out, when people need to get this job done, what are the things they currently reach for, and going and exploring how they are picking and choosing and deciding which ones to pick will often reveal those triggering events. These could be, in the customer's world, things that are changing. So there, again, a few things we can kind of break them into three main categories. There could be bad experiences. So they could be in a situation where their old solution is not working as it used to because of things that have happened. And uncovering those things that have happened is the bad experience switching trigger. The other one might be a change of circumstance. So they may have, maybe a good example of this is, since we talked about sports car, they've got a nice two-seater sports car, but the couple then learns that they're expecting. So all of a sudden they need more space for the baby. And so that's an example of a change in circumstance switching trigger. And then the last one is an awareness one. And so these could be, as people are moving through different points in their life, they may have different, things happen, maybe at the doctor's office, a diagnosis, good or bad, those kinds of news that we hear about. The problem or the event is rather neutral, but what we do with it could lead to that kind of a switching trigger. So those kind of triggers are oftentimes hidden below the surface. We don't really know that. And so I find that having a conversation with a potential customer that you want to serve, and not just one, but many such conversations, reveal these events like dominoes that make one thing fall after the other, and leads them down this path of wanting a new product. And that's where the innovation opportunity lies. I think this is where your tool of the customer forces canvas comes into play, right? Yeah, that's exactly right. So talk to me a little bit about that. What is that, if I'm not already familiar with that? What is it? How do I use it? And then we'll talk I want to really get into some of let's make this like very tactical for people, because I think that's one of the real strengths of your work, is you seem to be great at going from the abstract to the like, here's what to do. So the best way I find to describe the customer forces, it is a customer journey map. So we all maybe know, or at least conceptually know, what a customer journey is, a buyer journey. So how they might go through a series of steps to pick and choose a product and consume a product, decide to keep it. What's different is that rather than building a multi-page customer journey map with a whole bunch of things happening, we try to summarize that into these forces. And these forces are what's causing customers to do certain things. So customers happily moving along, and it's like a once upon a time story. They're happily moving along. Maybe I'll even tell one of those. Please. Maybe they're meeting some friends in a bar. They realize that 2 out of the 3 friends just recently bought a new car, and they're so happy with it. They're talking about all the new features that the car has. I don't know about you, but if I was in that room, all of a sudden my car, which was just fine before that conversation, starts to feel a little bit old. Like you get this this envy, and you may want to buy a car. So that's kind of how that story might begin, and that would be the planting of a switching trigger. Now, at that point, people don't immediately, of course, go out and buy a car, but this is where we get into this passive looking stage. And when we're in passive looking, we might start to notice billboards. We might start to hear ads on the radio that were always there. We just have this perceptual view that just gets a bit more acute. So we start paying attention to these things, still not deciding to buy the car. The following week, we realize that our car breaks down, and this isn't the first time it's actually happened. It had happened a month before. We take it in for a checkup. We realize we need major repairs. And so that's an example of the next trigger. So these kinds of triggers are occurring. And so we summarize those into things that are pushing the customer towards making a change. So I've got this old car. Now in my head, I'm seeing these forces stack. The push is pushing me towards a new car. I might start deciding which kind of car I'm looking for. Maybe I want an electric car, so I go and start looking at those. Each of those products I consider has a pull to them. So the push is pushing me to make a change. The pull is pulling me towards this top of the hill. If you can visualize, I'm trying to get to my destination. And I might consider multiple products along the way, and each will have a different strength of pull. And if it were all that easy, we would just be buying lots of products. There are these negative forces as well. So just like climbing a hill, there's the push and the pull that kind of makes us go up the hill. But then we have to deal with inertia and friction. And I'll define those. So inertia is essentially our unwillingness to change. So if we think about why wouldn't I want to buy a car? Well, I have an existing car. Yes, it's old, but do I really just need to go out and buy a new car? So that comfort of the old is where we want to just stay back and not do anything. So many times we get overwhelmed by inertia, and that's why we don't actually move forward with buying decisions. And so that's one of those negative forces. The other one is friction. As we imagine this new car, if I am thinking of getting an electric car, I get all kinds of anxieties, like where will I charge this? Do I have enough? Is it going to be enough to get me around town? Are there enough charging stations? And then price, can I really afford this car? Loans, all of those kinds of things are frictional forces that also keep me from moving forward. So we can break it into those forces into 4 forces that act on every decision we make about products. There's the push, there's the pull, there's inertia, and then there's friction. And when we unpack those forces, we can better understand how people make decisions at different points in that buyer journey, and which forces are driving them towards either moving forward or not. And that helps a lot with marketing, sales, designing better products.
How do you actually go about finding that stuff? I mean, the pithy answer is like, well, just go talk to people. But, I think one of the things I've picked up from your work is like, there is actually a bit of a sequencing to this that matters. And it's not quite that simple. And I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you might say that one can waste a lot of time and cycles by either doing this too soon or doing it too late. So how do you think about that? Or how do you guide people in that pursuit as they're trying to actually find these things?
Yeah, so it does start with customer conversations, but always the challenge with talking to customers is knowing a bit how to do it. So we oftentimes, I guess even before talking to customers, I see a lot of teams out there that just want to build some surveys and go in and run these surveys or do some focus groups. The challenge with surveys are good validation tools for confirming really what you already know. You want to just at scale be able to say, these questions I have, do these answers, the answers that I get back, do they kind of correlate with what I'm generally thinking? In the discovery work that we're talking about, discovery by definition requires learning things, insights that we don't know, and that's where the conversations help. The other trap people fall into is, let's just go and talk to customers and ask them what they want. And this is where, again, customers will usually give us a bunch of surface solutions or things that they may think they want, but when we actually go and build this, all of us have probably lived through that. Look at a backlog of features you get from your customers, and many of them are really just solutions disguised as problems. And the sad part is when you even build them for your customers, they're like, oh, that's not what I really wanted. Maybe go do this instead. So it's just a wild goose chase, and I've been on that treadmill many, many times. So that's why I bring that up. So approach that we want to take, and this is why I'm so excited and why Jobs to be Done kind of surface into a lot of, or I found its way into a lot of the work that I do, is that it's a backdoor to figuring out what people actually struggle with. And so when we are doing these conversations, we don't want to even lead with problems. We don't want to say, do you have problem X or Y? We actually want to lead with what are people trying to get done? Like when there's a situation that occurs, when it's, when something happens in their world and they're trying to get this job done or trying to get this outcome, where are they going? What are they doing? And that's when the forces start to play and you actually see them in the conversation. And that's the process that we follow. So running just half a dozen to a dozen of those interviews is a very effective way of understanding all the different stories, all the different ways that people are trying to get this thing done. And that's when you can go back and say, here's a cluster of things that seems interesting. And then we put on our entrepreneurial hat on and try to design solutions. And this whole process for how we might test that afterwards.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess the question I have, I've read and gone at least reasonably into the Jobs to be Done material, and I've done some of it myself in terms of practice, but I do not consider myself like an expert on it. And one thing I've noticed is that it's a really great conceptual model, right? Most people I talk to, they get it pretty quickly, but a lot of people really struggle to do it. And I'm curious, like, how do you like to do it? How do you actually like to conduct these interviews? Do you have a certain methodology or interview approach you use?
Yeah, so Jobs to be Done is a little bit, I like to describe it as a magic trick. It seems very obvious once you know the secret. Not the secret of how to do it, but once you know the insight you're trying to get. And those of you that are familiar with Jobs to be Done, there's the famous milkshake study. There are many of these things you can go and look at. If you don't know what that is, just Google Jobs to be Done milkshake study.
And for the listener, we'll link to all this stuff in the show notes. So perfect. Everything Ash was talking about that will also be linked, so you can just kind of check it out that way too.
Awesome, great. So if you actually look at that, there are some pretty irrational insights that this team uncovers. And once you know it, it almost seems like obvious in hindsight. And that's the challenge with all these Jobs to be Done pieces. And what I actually saw in the body of work, a lot of the thought leaders that you just mentioned, we're sharing all these amazing stories. And that I wanted to do those kinds of things, but I want to understand more of the how to do it, or how you actually do it. So the best way that I found to run the interviews is almost to use those forces as a mental model, kind of in the back of your head. So the push, pull, inertia, friction, and then think of the customer journey as a timeline. So we are trying to figure out what are a series of events that are happening to customers that are shaping their decisions along the way. And from those two models, we build a bit of a story arc or a narrative for how to conduct the interviews. This is where I'm not very big on scripting these interviews because we don't know which questions we need to be able to ask. But I do like to start with a handful of questions that can spring the conversation. So if I knew that somebody just joined a new gym, we'll start there and just say, oh, you joined this gym. And just like an interviewer, you then want to try to almost take a investigative reporter, journalist, movie producer type of a frame and say, scene by scene, let's try to figure out what happened. So you joined this gym, what day was it? Where did you buy, how did you buy this? Were you alone? And then let's kind of work backwards to what was that first domino that tipped? Maybe they got on a weighing scale and realized they were a few pounds heavier. Maybe something else happened. So we want to understand like what led that. And that's just how we run the conversation. So it's a very casual interview, much like this one, where you can just unpack everything that happened. And then we post-process all of that into this customer forces canvas. So we use that as a guide to say, where were all these forces and what was that interplay of forces? And the magic in all of this is when you go and have those half a dozen to a dozen conversations, the stories start running into each other. Yes, there are many reasons why people might join a gym initially for different goals, but there aren't an infinite number of them. There are usually a top 3 to 5, from my experience, of stories that you will hear on what caused somebody to go join the gym. And there's usually a top 3 to 5 of types of gyms that people pick. And once you start to see these patterns, that's when you begin to see these jobs-based clusters of people that you can potentially serve. And then again, that helps in prioritizing where to focus.
one of the things that I'm hoping you can help me and the listener with is understanding. I'm going to frame it this way, kind of like which tool when. It can be difficult when you're in those early stages and things are chaotic and confusing to think about, like, to orient yourself and to say, like, okay, like, where am I? Where do I need to go to next? What's the next thing I need to do, etc. So I'm hoping you can help me contextualize this a little bit for myself, selfishly, but also for the listener. So, for example, there's another interview approach I've read some of your material on in the past that I think you call the existing alternative interview. So, for example, like, how is that different than the kind of interview you're talking about now, both in terms of what you do with the interview and also when you do that interview, and maybe also why you do that interview?
Sure.
To throw like five questions at once at you.
Yeah, I'll see how we can get through all that.
Yeah, this is for the listener. This is bad interviewing technique. Just I want to call myself out. This is not how you do a good interview. But it was a jumbled mess in my head. But maybe Ash can sort me out.
Well, so the first thing I'll say is that the existing alternative interview, as opposed to, say, a triggering event interview, are the two types of interviews that I generally talk about. The way we run them are still the goal is the same. We're trying to unpack the journey that the customer went, and so maybe I'll explain why they're named different. Sometimes when you have an idea, we know what the triggering events are. Like, we talked about the pandemic. We know that this pandemic thing is happening and it's causing a lot of disruption. So we might say, this is happening. Let's go and find people affected by this. And again, that's an easier thing. But maybe if we go into a particular subset of customers, let's go like the nature of work. Let's go and find companies that would normally work in person. Now that they're working remotely, let's go and see how they're struggling. Right. So we start with the pandemic, and then we're going and just asking people in this group, how are they trying to get that done? So that's kind of more in the framing. Other times we may start with an existing alternative. So sometimes the triggering events are easy to identify, but they're hard to go and find. They're not that actionable because we can't find people just because they have this trigger, because it happens on their head and we don't have any evidence of it. So maybe an example that I can share there is, how do you find a new startup founder, right? So we know that they had to have an idea. They maybe are working on something, but what do I look for, right? And that's where the existing alternatives can help. So when a startup founder has a new idea, maybe they're going to a meetup group. And so if I just go to the grocery store, I'm not going to find that startup founder. But if I go to a meetup group where they're talking about starting up, they may be there. So we might start with the existing alternative, and that's where that's how we start that framing, which is, you join this meetup group. What were you looking to accomplish? And then how did you learn about it? And then we can just start unpacking those forces. It may not be a meetup group. They may have bought a course, maybe bought a book. So this is where we start looking at complementary existing alternatives that they would have considered and maybe purchased. And that gives us a place to go and find people like that.
So it sounds like, at the end of the day, we want to understand both the triggers as well as the existing alternatives to really understand our customer better. But which tool we use will depend on kind of where we're starting from. So if we have an idea, or for example, if we know the trigger, like we know that the pandemic changed things, okay, we don't need to go do the trigger interview because we know what the trigger is. Now we can do the existing alternative interview to figure out, like, well, what are you doing about that? Or alternatively, it might be inverted, where we know that someone joined a gym, but we want to understand the forces that led to that. And so then we would do more of the customer forces type interviews. Am I understanding that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Correct me if I'm wrong, Ash, but I think I've heard you I think you have a very particular definition of what an early adopter is. How should we think about what an early adopter actually is, as opposed to this sort of fuzzy concept of an early, air quotes, early adopter?
Yeah, so that's actually a big one, because a lot of people, when we are asked when they're asked to define an early adopter, start layering on a whole bunch of avatar and persona type stuff. Let's start thinking of their age, their gender, and we start like doing the classic customer segmentation. The danger with that kind of approach is that you may have too many distinguishing characteristics where it becomes harder to find. If you're trying to find the early adopter, it becomes harder, more expensive to try to find enough of them. So the art of early adopter definition, in my opinion, is not trying to find the most specific distinguishing characteristics, but the least specific distinguishing characteristics that also correlate with them buying or wanting to buy your product. And so it's kind of a counterintuitive way at coming at it, because we're always taught, go narrow and go really specific. But the part you have to recognize is that at the very beginning, we don't know much of anything about who our ideal customers are. And so the more narrow you go, the more chances are you're just going to be wrong or find a small hill, right? So another example is that I obviously work with a lot of entrepreneurs. If we stay stuck in the stereotypical two guys in a garage in Silicon Valley as a definition of an entrepreneur, I could go to Silicon Valley and actually find those entrepreneurs and said, see, I was right. This is where all the entrepreneurs are. But of course, miss the mountain of entrepreneurs that are all around the world that transcend, gender, age, geography, right? And so it's a much, much bigger mountain of an opportunity that I would just completely miss out on. So that's the danger when we try to go so narrow and find that early adopter based on, those many criteria. So the one thing that I find that all early adopters have in common is that they had to have taken action. And that's what we're really looking for. So in that customer journey story, they all had to have gotten triggered, and everyone gets triggered, like the pandemic triggers different people at different times. But early adopters are different in that they took some action as a result of it. So when we are trying to find, say, early adopters for video conferencing, triggering event happens. A lot of us look at it. A lot of us say, I wish I could do all these things. And then a lot of us do nothing. The early adopters are the ones who start taking that next action. So if we can find them going into that passive looking stage or active looking stage or buying and consuming phase, those are going to be where you find potential early adopters. Now, it gets a bit tricky because we don't quite know where our entry could be. So if you think of it as a timeline, people will start looking for products, start trying products, and based on which problem you're solving, your entry point might be while they are looking for a new product, while they're in that triggered mode and looking for a solution. That's where if you showed up and said, hey, I'm better than everyone else, they'll buy what you have. It could be that they have to use something to realize that it doesn't work before they consider your product. And it sounds weird, but we have all been there where we go and buy the more popular solution and then realize that it actually has problems that are things that are not going to work for us. And we had to have gone through that journey. So part of the discovery is figuring out where is that ideal entry point. And then that's when the early adopter gets shaped up in a much, much more clearer fashion.
Let's say early adopters share a triggering event and basically a job to be done. So they sort of have the journey is bookended similarly, right? Like they started here, they got triggered in a way, and they're trying to go to the same kind of outcome. And then there's presumably some shared existing alternatives along the way. The thing I was trying to understand was, okay, so there's these different phases of that journey, and what do I do with that knowledge once I have it? And I think one of the things that I'm hearing you say here, and please correct me, is that if you know the phases, you can find the people much more easily, right? If you know that this is the story, like where to go look for these people. Whereas if you don't have that, it's like you're spinning around in circles. Like, where do you even go?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'll maybe share a concrete example that might help some. So one of the products that I did work on in that 2010 timeframe as well was an analytics product, and it was targeted at startups. And we've eventually landed with our early adopter definition as being a tech founder 3 months after launch. And so that kind of sounds very weird, like 3 months after launch. Why 3 months? And that's because it took that long for them to hit the problem that we were trying to solve. And so we needed not just, if we had just gone after tech founders, they would have been too early, too late. And that's what I mean by that nuanced definition of the early adopter. And so I'll kind of explain kind of their journey. So our product was designed to prevent, to help startup founders make sense of their metrics. We may all have experienced metrics. We live in a world today where we can measure almost anything if you have a digital product. But the
was this
challenge
user cycle?
This user cycle, exactly, yeah. So it's an actual product that I worked on, but we're trying to do a lot, getting to actionable insights with fewer metrics. And the problem we were trying to solve was the drowning problem. So if you look at that startup founder, they launch a product, emotion, really optimistic, very excited, new product launch. But it takes only a few weeks or maybe a month for them to realize that no one's buying their product. Conversion rates are low. They're getting lots of signups, but maybe no one's activating, no one's purchasing at the end of the month. And so they get all depressed. What do? They start investing in metrics. So they may put Google Analytics, they may put Mixpanel, you can kind of list all the names out there. And this, again, back in 2010, many of these products have gotten to do what we were trying to do back then. But back then, not many of them were doing this. But I'll just describe the timeline. So as they start to layer on these products, the realization they get is we're not getting clearer on what's broken. We know that no one's buying. That was not anything new. We just don't know why. And that's what our product helped people get to. Had we gone there in the very beginning and said, use us, we are this startup and we help you figure out why, that would have in some ways not caused a switch, because people would go and pick the cheaper, Google Analytics being free, the more popular solutions. And so we had to have them go through that 2-month cycle, month 1 to implement these solutions, month 2 to realize that we're now drowning in numbers. There's a new problem that we are struggling with. It's not more numbers, but we want to get to some action, some actionable metrics. And that was our unique value proposition. So we kind of waited. And so we would just go out, and even when people would ask us about user cycle, we had created this little kind of intake list. We would ask them, have you launched? Have you not launched? And we could almost predict with pretty good certainty that if they met our criteria, we had 3 questions we asked. And if they said yes to all 3, that only then would we show them a demo, and our conversion rates were very high to a trial. It was like 90% at that point.
This is a really great pivot point. I want to spend some time talking about kind of traction roadmaps and the way that people who are getting started can think about this journey that they are undertaking. And it's, ironically, you're just talking about these startup founders going through that first few months of the journey. But I'd love you to maybe start by framing some of the big milestones and defining them. And then let's talk about how one thinks about mapping out that. So maybe you could start by laying out some of the big milestones, like some of the customer problem fit and so on and so forth.
Sure. I would say that the first significant milestone that lots of startups like to think about is product market fit. And for a lot of startups, that's hard to quantify, which is part of the problem, but they kind of have a qualitative feel. That's when the hockey stick hits this inflection point where the product just starts selling like crazy. You're getting customers come through the door. And so we kind of know it. We can actually feel it. But the challenge that I saw a lot of people struggle with is know how to measure it. And that's where this traction roadmap kind of helps. We start by framing that milestone, because if you don't quite know what product market fit is, the strategy you use is going to be just all over the place. Do you know whether you should shift into growth mode or still stay in product mode? We don't quite know what that transition is. So that's the struggle that I saw lots of founders struggle with. And then what we have done further is taken that product market fit point, which generally is about 2 years on average to get to for most products. But we break that journey down into a series of sub milestones, as you were starting to describe. So before product market fit, we started talking about a smaller version of product market fit, which you might think of as just solution customer fit. You building an MVP and giving it to a customer, a handful of customers, and them saying, thumbs up, this is great. And then even prior to that, we talk about problem solution fit, which is even knowing what to build. If you don't quite have the right problem to solve, the solution is not going to matter. So we can, again, go and take some of these, the discovery process I was describing with the customer forces to help frame the problems that we should go after. And then even prior to that, we're big fans of business model fit. Is that even before doing anything, we want to make sure that it's going to be worthwhile at the end. I've seen too many people, myself included, where we just rush out the building. We find customers, we build an MVP, and then 6 or 9 months later, we realize that, the market was not as big as we thought. And the sad news there is that you didn't have to wait 6 or 9 months to hit that realization. Had we done some business modeling, even on paper in the very early phases of the project, you would have shown that, okay, this is not maybe the right path to go down. So business, if you work kind of forwards, business model fit, then problem solution fit, solution customer, product market.
That makes perfect sense. And I can attest from my own experience. One of the things I've really benefited from is the tooling that you all have built. And again, like we're going to have links to all this in the show notes for the listener, but I highly recommend if you have not actually tried the Lean Stack tooling, go sign up for a free account, give it a go. It'll like make this all very concrete very quickly. But one of the things that I found so helpful about your work and not just the concepts, but the tools was that it helped me save a bunch of time, like you're pointing to, right? Like if I can, beat on a model on paper for a day and realize like, oh man, even if we crush it in this model, it's just not there's just not enough meat on that bone. Like it's just not going to be the kind of business that we aspire to have. Then like, okay, well then before we go spend, 6 months of our lives on this, like let's do something a little different. So I really appreciate that because I think what it sounds like you responded to in a way was, Steve Blank came in so hard and Lean Startup came in so hard with the drumbeat of, get out of the building, get out of the building, get out of the building, which was the right thing because everyone was spending way too much time in the building. But then we almost like overcorrected and threw out all modeling. And it's like, well, okay, hold on. A little bit of modeling can go a long way. We just don't need like 30-page business plan. And so I'm appreciative that you kind of like brought us back brought us back a little, the pendulum back just a little bit. Was that what you intended to do, or how did you see that?
So it was not intended. As I mentioned, I was one of those who wanted to rush out the building because as you said, all the answers are out there. So go out and figure it out along the way. But as I did that, I found that myself and a few others included, we were kind of hitting these local maxima where we were finding products that were working for just smaller groups of people. And then some of these were hard pivots to then switch the customer segment. And so could that time have been saved? Could we have avoided all that needless work? That's kind of what prompted the question. And it just came back to trying to model, ask those questions in the very early stages. And the way I like to explain it now is that certainly when we start thinking of experiments we run with, we think in terms of empirical experiments with customers, but we sometimes don't think about thought experiments that we can do. And thought experiments can be just as powerful. And of course, there are going to be biases and things. And so we have to be wary of that, but they can be just as powerful to invalidate ideas. So a thought experiment, if it works, doesn't mean your idea is going to work. You still have to get outside the building and validate it. But if a thought experiment, as you were just describing, proves with pretty high certainty that in the best case scenario, this is just not going to give you what you're looking for, then that's invalidation. There's no point even going down that end path. And that's kind of how we look at that. So thought experiments can be powerful. I mean, Albert Einstein, for crying out loud, came up with the theory of relativity with a thought experiment.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like good science, right? A theory can never be proven true, but it can definitely be proven wrong. Right. So similarly, like if we can invalidate the thing on paper, cool. And then the only, quote unquote truth here is when it actually works in the market. But if we can increase our odds, then let's take it. So let's I want to summarize this and try to put it into a loose sense of a process for the listener, because obviously we're talking about a lot of ideas here and I want to try to ground these a little bit. And for the listener, I highly encourage you, go get the new edition of the book and check out the tools there. It's all made Ash does a great job of making this very concrete. But since we're in your ears right now, we've got to like kind of frame it up for you a little bit. So if I'm hearing you right, there, and I think your overarching framework here is sort of first model, then prioritize, then go test.
That's right.
And so if we think about that, there's the modeling using the kind of the traction modeling we were just talking about, and then you get out into the more experimental stuff with customers. And within that process, it sounds like there's kind of a sequence of milestones along the way that we can think about in terms of the traction modeling that we then have to go prove in the real world. And if I'm hearing you right, it sounds like those milestones are sort of first we've got, and I'm saying this in sort of a time sequence. First, we've got basically customer problem fit. Like we know who they are, what the problem is, what's the job to be done, all the customer forces stuff we were talking about earlier. Then we've got problem solution fit of like, well, we knew the problem, now we know what to do about it. And then finally, then we've got sort of solution customer fit of meaning like the solution's working for them, they're buying it. And then, as you continue to scale, you get to some place of product market fit. So I guess my two questions would be, first of all, did I get that right? Is that the right sequencing? And then secondly, is there some way you can quantify that? Like, how do you know if you've got those milestones or not?
Yeah. So that is the right sequencing. And maybe I'll just add like one more tool that we use. So the very first tool that I like to start with is not even the traction roadmap. It's more just getting the idea out of people's heads. And we do that with a lean canvas. So a lean canvas has got these 9 boxes or 12 boxes, if you count some of the sub boxes, of just letting someone to say, I have this idea, and tell me a story about your idea. Who's your customer? What problem are you solving? How are you going to solve it? So that's what the canvas helps them do. And it's designed to fit on a single page. So that constraint brings, again, clarity into one's thinking. People would love to say, talk for hours about their idea, but forcing them into fitting it into a single page just has this power of bringing clarity. So that's usually where we start. And then we start applying these stress tests and these thought experiments. So we might do a first stress test on desirability. That's where the innovator's gift comes in. So don't tell me what problem you're solving. Instead, tell me what's broken in the world. So point to the triggering event, point to an existing alternative that you can do, that your product is better with respect to, right? So that's how we bring the desirability test. We then talk about viability, and that's where that traction road mapping comes in. So we start by framing those milestones and start to do some of these back of the envelope calculations to say, can this even work? And then the final test before we get out of the building is feasibility. So it's great that we have a problem. The problem is big enough. The market's big enough. Can we actually build it? Do we have the right team? Do we have the right tech? Is it going to be cost prohibitive for us to build? All of those kinds of things. And if we can get checks on all three, as I said, it doesn't guarantee that you're going to hit it off out the ballpark, but your odds are much higher. So that's kind of how we prep that. So your last question at the end there was, how do we put some numbers? Is that?
Yeah. So once we've gotten those check marks, right? So we've done our stress tests on paper with desirability, viability, and feasibility, and we are getting out of the building now. And now we're aiming, and you have some really nice graphics and kind of modeling this ramp up over time of traction from sort of, customer problem fit to problem solution fit to solution customer fit to product market fit, whether quantitatively or qualitatively. But like, how do you know if someone's going down this path? Like, how do I know when I actually have customer problem fit, or how do I know when I actually have solution customer fit?
Sure. Yeah. So part of that traction roadmap, when we have defined those milestones, those are those qualitative markers in the journey. We need to have actual traction metrics associated with them. Whether these are numbers of customers or number of users, we need to have actual numbers tied to them. How we come to those starts by thinking in terms of where we're headed. So I love this. I don't know who's the original, who actually said this originally, but if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there, right? So if you don't have a destination in mind, we can come up with all kinds of validation stories. Oh, I have 10 customers. Is that enough? I don't know. Do I have 100? Is that enough? I don't know, right? So we need to know where we're headed. And so this is where in the book and in our work, I described this concept. When people try to think about goals and where they're headed, they start to frame it in terms of maximum upside potential. In other words, how big can my idea get? That's a very hard number to estimate. And we know this. You can go and look at, especially the unicorns. All of them didn't think they were going to be unicorns till they actually one day realized they were on the path to becoming one. So we can't really predict those. And there's just so much uncertainty. So we don't know what that will look like. So I instead focus on a different number, which is not what's the maximum upside potential, but rather what's the minimum success criteria. And we time frame this with a 3-year horizon. Why 3 years? Because most products can hit product market fit in the first 2 years, kind of give or take some. So we're giving ourselves a little bit of time to achieve product market fit. Now, how do you know what you're aiming for? That is more a function of either one's ambition or the kinds of environment you're operating. So if you are a startup, one of the first questions I would probably ask you is, are you looking to raise money? And if you're looking to raise money, all of a sudden your environment is going to dictate what product market fit needs to be like, because the investors are not just going to put money because they like your idea. They're going to put money in your business because it's out competing other benchmarks of companies that they might consider putting money into. So once we understand where we're headed at product market fit, and you can go and do some of that research, you can find what are investors valuing today, and that becomes the goal. And then we back ourselves from there. And then there's kind of some simple math you can do to extrapolate that back all the way down to 3 months, 90 days at a time. You can figure out how much traction you need to be able to show in your hockey stick to show the investor or your own team that you're progressing in the right way. So there's always a number, and the hardest conversations I have are with bootstrapped entrepreneurs who say, I don't know, I just want to build something successful. I want to build something big. So we have to then unpack, what does big mean? And so here it could be helpful to think, how big of a company do you want to build? Do you want a 1,000-person company? And people will say, oh no, that's just crazy. Maybe just 10 people. Okay, well, now we're getting somewhere, because if you've got 10 people, we might know what payroll needs to look like. Would you like to add some additional buffer for profit and other things? And this is where we can come up with some kind of a goal that the team can march towards. But it's that kind of thinking.
It adds a sense of rigor, kind of like some basic intellectual rigor to an otherwise extremely nebulous process, right? It is true that 0 to 1 stage of anything, whether it's a startup, a book, a podcast, like whatever, anything creative, right? 0 to 1 is always a little crazy. And I feel like anything we can do, any tools we can employ, whether they're, internal tools like thought experiments or external tools like, a certain kind of interview, that will help us navigate that uncertainty is a good thing. We're doing ourselves and ultimately our customers a favor, because as we increase our odds, we can actually, we're more likely to make the contribution we seek to make. Whereas there's far too many of us who die along the road, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that's one of the things I really appreciate.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I want to go ahead and start to close out here with a couple rapid fire questions. They're short questions. You can kind of take them any way you want to take them, and feel free to, the short questions are short, but your answers can be long if you are feeling so moved. But just a second ago, you were commenting that one of the hardest conversations you have is with founders, particularly at the bootstrap stage, who don't really know what they want, right? Like they haven't defined success. And I guess my question for you would be at this stage for you, or in this next chapter you go into, whether with this book or whatever else you've got cooking up, what does success look like for you at this point?
I guess it's moving this body of work forward, and maybe I'll describe, like, I'm more kind of in the purpose stage. Maybe I'll take a step back. I know it kind of sounds weird to just start talking about purpose without context. Okay. I look at the entrepreneurial journey as being 3 stages, and I see this true with myself. I see it true with many people that I've worked with. Is we generally start in the artist stage, where we are building stuff and it's really cool. We want to make a dent in the universe, all those things. So let's put our art out there and really create something amazing. And so I've kind of been through that stage, and many times, unfortunately, our art doesn't really sell, or that's when we get into stage 2, where we realize that artists need to eat as well. It's not just creating cool, amazing, stuff. And so that's when we get into this business money making type of a stage. And so we start doing a lot of that viability thinking. We start thinking of price. I was a tech founder, we start getting more into marketing, sales, or get people on the team who can address those gaps. So that's kind of a phase where we start thinking about kind of business model outcomes from a money perspective. That's stage 2. And then there's kind of the stage afterwards, when you've got your basic needs met, you kind of are okay, and you're not really looking for that next big exit necessarily. And that's the purpose stage. And that's kind of what I hit with this newer company, Lean Stack. As I was going through my blog writing journey, is I could see that it took me 7 years to transform my thinking from kind of the old way of building products to this new way. If we could shorten that cycle for the next generation of entrepreneurs, that would be a really cool thing to do. And so that's kind of what I define as success. If we can shorten that cycle time and let them make their own new mistakes, but at least don't make these same mistakes that I've spent lost time on. Yeah.
No, I love that. It's we all stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, right? So it's like, make new, better mistakes. Go take some new ground. How do you? I mean, I love the intention of what you're saying, and as someone who's a direct beneficiary, I'll say thanks. So we really appreciate it. But I love that idea. How do you measure that? Do you have like a North Star metric of your own that you think about? Yeah,
I mean, for a while we had a number of entrepreneurs we would like to be able to have have said we have touched in some way kind of usage of our tools. So we kind of use those kinds of metrics. At one point that was 1 million entrepreneurs and we crossed that threshold. And so we're like, okay, we need to now. So I like to think in terms of 10x. So now we have just 10x that number. And we're waiting to see, can we get 10 million people at some point saying, I use these tools and I've got some, saved some time or made some progress in my idea. That would be amazing.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And I love the 10x thinking you do with the Fermi estimates. It's great because you're like, all right, cool, we'll cross that one, just 10x it and let's get back to work.
Right.
It's nice. Yeah, that's terrific. I appreciate that. So one of the things that I think a lot about is questions, right? And I don't say that just as somebody who does a podcast, but I think, the questions we ask ourselves determine the way we think and then what we do. And I guess one of the questions I would ask you is if you could have the listener start to ask themselves a question on a regular basis, and whether that, regular, whether that's a day, every day or every week, whatever, some cadence you think would be impactful. What question would you have them ask themselves and how often?
So I almost start I tend to be more accomplishment driven. Like I can go, when I go to bed at night, I almost try to look back and say, did I move something forward? So really in the morning when I wake up, it usually is before I even do anything. One of the first prompts that I give myself is what's the one thing I need to get done today? And usually that's one of, there are kind of different versions of this, rock and all these kinds of things that you probably are familiar with, but it's just that one thing question. Like, what's the one thing that you can do to move something forward? And in there is baked this idea of problems before solutions. Sometimes uncovering the right thing requires unpacking the problem a bit more. So all of that kind of falls out of it. But that's almost a first principle of mine and something we try to instill with everyone that we work with, my team included, is let's not rush to building stuff without having evidence of something being broken in the first place. So a lot of the work that I do sometimes seemingly looks like sitting on my armchair just thinking, but I'm really just trying to understand, like, how do we prioritize? That's that prioritize step.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I love that way of thinking of, you hear it phrased different ways, like you were saying, what's the one thing that makes everything else either easier or unnecessary. But that whole, and great book, by the way, we'll link to that in the show notes. But I really appreciate that. What is a quote or a saying, is there any quote or saying that you return to that has been impactful for you? And what about it speaks to you?
Oh, there are so many. I think if you look at my book, I think almost, at least with some of the earlier editions, this time my publisher for some reason didn't want as many quotes in there, but I've got lots of them. So I think it's very contextual for me. I would say, like, I'm a huge fan of Edwards Deming. I mean, Steve Jobs has a lot of stuff. Peter Drucker has a lot of stuff. But if kind of on topic, I would say, just recognizing that it's not the customer's job to know what they want, I think is probably a very powerful one. And that came from Steve Jobs. And so really when we talk to customers, and I see this trap that people run into a lot, is really asking the customer instead of trying to discover where they are trying to go and everything we've talked about, the forces and things. But that's a very powerful one. And I think it drives a lot of the work. And, people will often cite the great Steve Jobs and talk about how he could see the future, but he did this by, again, a lot of thought experiments and a lot of observation and a lot of asking the question of why are people doing the things they're doing? Why are they living with these hard to use products? And then he went off and thought of something better.
That makes a lot of sense. It reminds me of and I don't know where I heard this. You've probably said it, and so have other people. I really don't know, but something I've told people on my teams over the years many, many times. We'll go into user interviews or things like that. I'm like, look, it's their job to be the expert on what's broken, and it's our job to figure out how to fix it. Yep. And let's just keep that in mind because it's so easy. Like you said, you can end up with this backlog full of stuff, and none of it really works, and it's like backlog whiplash. right? You just get like yanked around thing to thing. And if you don't have that, you haven't dug underneath it all into those forces. You're at the mercy of like recency bias. If what's the last thing said by the loudest person, and if you're in that place, you got bigger problems. At least that's how I think about it. So, one of the things I wanted to ask you was, and this is something I like to do, especially with somebody like you, who I followed your work for so long now, and you've really, you can count me in your metric of people who you've impacted the thinking of. Like I'm 100% in that count. But who impacted your thinking? Like who's really shaped your thinking and the way you see the world?
Yeah, some of the names you've already mentioned. So there are many of the early lean startup thinkers. I would say as I was going through this journey, they were big influences. Prior to that, of course, I had many mentors. But if we stay within this framework, I would say they were big ones. People like Steve Blank for sure, Eric Ries. And then many others, Sean Ellis, Dave McClure, a lot of the metrics models we use. So if you look at my work, I sometimes say I'm a bit like a DJ, as I take tracks from many different places, systems thinking, jobs to be done. Bob Muesta, you mentioned him. So all those folks have been like huge giants in my own body of work. But I take all these little pieces and I'm a curator. Like I try to find how to stitch them together, how to make the tools that can make it easier to understand, easier to use. So that's kind of what drives me. But all of those folks are big influencers in that work.
Yeah, you really seem like it seems like you and I similarly identify as like, I would call it maybe a synthesizer or a curator, where, I can kind of like see all these things and figure out a way to smush them together into something useful. And that's often the way I can make a unique contribution. So that's interesting. Does that show up for you elsewhere? Is that like just how your brain works?
I think it's how my brain works. There used to be a show that I grew up with. I think it was called Contacts or Connections, maybe Connections. I think it was a British show, but it was all patterns. Like they would start the story with, like maybe there's a shipwreck happening, and then they would lead that to something else, and that connects to this other thing. And it was all these connections in the story, and you would end up in these random places. And I found that very fascinating. So I have this, maybe rather naive belief that everything is somehow connected. There is a unified theory of everything. So when I even encounter a book, even if it's a fiction book and there's an interesting point of view there, I always try to relate it to something, a problem that I'm thinking about, or how could this be applied in some way. So this is how my brain works for some reason.
Yeah, no, just listening to you right there, it reminded me of one book and one really great talk that I'm curious if you've come across. The book is, I think it's called They All Laughed. And it's the story, it's like the origin story of all these innovations and basically that like the world was like, that's dumb. No way that's going to work. But it turned out to be, this amazing contribution to humanity. And the second one, that's on the sort of innovation connection side. But then the other one, have you by any chance seen the talk done by Tom Chi? He did a talk called, I think it's called Everything is Connected.
Okay.
Have you seen this talk?
No, I have not.
All right. It's same idea you're talking about, but he actually ends up taking it to an almost like metaphysical level, but proving that like from almost a physics point of view. It is awesome. I'll send you the link, and everyone listening, you should definitely check this. It's like a 20-minute talk that he did, I think at like the Mind Valley Summit a couple years ago, but like it'll just hit you.
Awesome.
Like it's good.
Yeah, I wrote it down too, but I'd love a link.
Yeah, I will send you the link, and for the listener, this will all be in show notes. But I think those might resonate with you, especially given our shared topical interests. So, I hope you let me know what you think when you check them out. Well, awesome, Ashley. This has been an absolute pleasure. As I said, I've admired and followed and benefited from your work for well over a decade now. So thanks for taking some time out of your day to hang with me and our listeners. And for the listener, we are going to link to all this stuff in the show notes. I highly recommend go sign up for Lean Stack, use the tools, get Ash's book. I've been through all this stuff. I can tell you, like, I don't recommend it lightly. It's legit. Do it. It will help you. And it's, as you can tell by listening to Ash, the guy knows what he's talking about. So Ash, first off to you, big gratitude and thank you for being here and for your work. What would you just like to leave the listener with, and where can people find you to follow along for the journey?
Yeah, first, thank you, Andrew. I'll probably leave you with the first mindset that we teach, and it's kind of the theme of the talk today. But it's love the problem, not your solution, and that's probably the thing that it's the easiest thing to think you understand, but I think it can take many decades to kind of get that right. Is we as humans just usually gravitate towards solutions over problems. So hopefully that's something you can take away. And a lot of what we do is just kind of peeling that onion a bit, a bit further. In terms of where to find me, you already mentioned LeanStack. That's the company I run. That's kind of where I live. My email is just ash@leanstack.com. I do look at my email a lot, so that's a place you can definitely hit me if you've got questions, comments. And then the same, my first name, last name, Ash Maurya is my handle on many things. So LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram. So you can find me in all those places.
Awesome. Ash, well, again, thank you so much. And thanks for being here today. Keep it up. Good luck with the book.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this, I'd be so grateful if you could do me a favor and take about 25 seconds to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. That helps me reach way more listeners, and it also helps me bring you more great guests. As always, please feel free to reach out to me anytime at connect@makethingsthatmatter.com. And until next time, my friends, leave them better than you found them. See you out there.